Welcome to This Explainer. We're looking at Theme 3, Disillusionment and Cultural Rebellion, which is really about the fracture of modernity. You know, before 1914, Western civilization was riding high. People had this uncritical faith in science and the absolute inevitability of human progress. But then, the trauma of the trenches shattered that pre-war optimism entirely. It's a story of profound psychological and cultural collapse.
Okay, let's dive right into this with a phrase you've probably heard before. You are a lost generation. It was actually coined by the writer Gertrude Stein, reportedly after she heard a French garage owner yell it at his young mechanic. But it perfectly captured young Americans, guys like Ernest Hemingway and F. Scott Fitzgerald, who emerged from the war feeling, well, completely morally adrift and spiritually hollow. At its core, This Explainer is a story about a massive loss of innocence. The youth who went off to fight for glory, they came back to a world that just didn't make sense anymore.
Section 1. The collapse of faith. And this brilliantly illustrates that massive shift. To understand the cultural rebellion of the 1920s, we have to look at the destruction of those old European certainties. Before 1914, Dorian culture was all about celebrating empire, technological achievement, patriotism. There was this complete moral certainty. Society leaned heavily on social Darwinism and industrial optimism. They really thought civilization was just on a steady upward march toward prosperity. But after 1918, that was entirely replaced by shell shock, deep cultural despair, and a really profound distrust of leaders. The returning veterans had seen the absolute darkest side of industrial progress.
Which brings us to a critical vocabulary term for this era: disillusionment. It's that feeling of severe disappointment when you realize something isn't nearly as good as you believed it was. See, traditional authorities, the monarchies, churches, aristocracies, parliamentary governments, they were entirely discredited. And why? Because they were the exact same institutions that sent millions of young soldiers to die in the mud of the Western Front, at places like Verdun and the Somme. I mean, you can't send an entire generation into a meat grinder and expect them to come back trusting the system that put them there, right? Which leads us directly to the catalyst for this massive cultural collapse.
Part 2. A mechanized nightmare.
So, going in, government propaganda in places like Britain, France, and Germany promised their citizens that the war would be this brief, heroic adventure. They literally told soldiers they'd be home by Christmas. But the reality was mechanized warfare. Instead of these grand, heroic cavalry charges, soldiers faced a mechanized nightmare of machine guns and just unrelenting artillery barrages. And maybe most terrifyingly, chlorine gas, which was used on a mass scale by Germany at the Second Battle of Ypres in 1915. The battlefield had literally been transformed into an industrial slaughterhouse.
Over 1 million casualties. Just take a second and let that massive number sink in. That is the casualty count from the Battle of the Somme alone. One single campaign. The sheer unprecedented scale of this industrial slaughter fueled incredible feelings of betrayal among the veterans who somehow managed to survive. And you can really hear this betrayal finding its voice in the poetry of the time. Early on, idealistic poets like Rupert Brooke were writing these romantic verses celebrating military sacrifice. But as the war ground on, that completely shifted. Take that old Roman phrase, dulce et decorum est pro patria mori. It is sweet and fitting to die for one's country. Well, that ancient claim was bitterly mocked by the poet Wilfred Owen, who tragically was killed in action just 1 week before the armistice. He, along with writers like Siegfried Sassoon, started writing incredibly graphic anti-war poetry. They completely condemned the glorification of conflict, pointing out that the official propaganda was entirely disconnected from the horrific reality of poison gas and mass death. Moving on to Section 3, Art of the Lost Generation. So how did society process this unprecedented trauma? Well, they shifted entirely away from Enlightenment rationality and moved toward modernism. Because society simply couldn't accept an uncritical faith in human progress anymore, young expatriate writers and artists felt totally adrift. They needed a radical break with the past. They basically had to invent entirely new forms of expression in art, literature, and music, simply because the old forms, they just didn't make sense in a broken world. What followed was a massive literary explosion. Let's walk through this, because these landmark works emerged directly from the war's trauma, and they completely stripped away the so-called heroic adventure of war to reveal its true psychological cost. In 1922, you have T.S. Eliot publishing The Wasteland, using this highly fragmented imagery to express deep cultural despair. Then in 1929, Ernest Hemingway gives us A Farewell to Arms, which portrays wars strictly as meaningless carnage. And that exact same year, Erich Maria Remarque publishes All Quiet on the Western Front. That book was a real game changer because it brilliantly presented the war through the eyes of German soldiers, which really humanized the supposed enemy for readers all across the globe. Now, what's really fascinating here is how the visual arts and even the sciences mirrored this exact same fragmented, traumatized state of the world. Pablo Picasso's Cubism literally took visual reality and fragmented it into pieces. You have Dadaism emerging to openly mock reason and the very idea of social order. Surrealism, which we associate with Salvador Dalí, dived deep into the irrational. And even in psychology, Sigmund Freud's theories about the unconscious mind and irrational drives had largely been ignored when he introduced them back in 1899. But now, suddenly they gained massive, widespread acceptance because people were desperately searching for explanations for the war's epidemic of mass violence and shell shock.
Section 4. The Rise of Authoritarianism. But hey, this cultural rebellion wasn't just limited to art galleries and novels. To millions of Europeans in the 1920s, liberal democracy was starting to look incredibly weak, indecisive, and completely incapable of solving urgent economic crises. And that created what we call a political vacuum. When populations lose faith in traditional authority, it creates this huge void, and radical new ideologies, from communism to fascism, rushed right in to fill it. They were offering strict order, clear enemies, and a renewed sense of national purpose.
Let's move on and see how fast this builds sequentially, because it is rapid. In 1917, the Russian Revolution overthrows the Tsar and Lenin establishes the world's first communist state. By 1919, in post-war Italy, Benito Mussolini founds the Fasci di Combattimento. Just 3 years later, in 1922, Mussolini marches on Rome and actually becomes prime minister. And then in 1923, Adolf Hitler leads the failed beer hall putsch in Munich, attempting to overthrow the fragile Weimar Republic, which, by the way, was constantly struggling to survive attacks from radical factions on both the left and the right. Now, it is absolutely crucial to understand that these radical factions didn't just conquer by brute force alone. They managed to consolidate power through the legitimizing collaboration of desperate traditional institutions. Old aristocracies, the German military, and even the Catholic Church, which actually formalized its relationship with Mussolini through the 1929 Lateran Treaty. They often accommodated these new regimes. They did this hoping they could preserve their own influence, but ultimately, they just helped legitimize radical rule across the entire continent. And this accommodation paved the direct path to totalitarianism. This is a Tier 3 vocabulary word you definitely need to know for this era. It describes a centralized, dictatorial system that requires absolute, complete subservience to the state. Through the late 1920s and into the 1930s, Mussolini in Italy, Joseph Stalin in the Soviet Union, and eventually Hitler in Germany, they all utilized this widespread disillusionment to consolidate absolute totalitarian control.
Section 5. Enduring Modernist Legacies.
All right, so we've seen the art and we've seen the politics. Now let's summarize how this post-war fracture continues to shape our world. The cultural rebellion born in those trenches revolutionized modern thought. You have Picasso continuing his anti-war critique with his absolute masterpiece Guernica in 1937, responding to the bombing of a Spanish town. Pacifist movements grew massively in Britain and France, spreading like wildfire thanks to powerful new mass media like film and radio. The whole concept of the lost generation has actually endured to describe any cohort shaped by collective trauma, which greatly influenced anti-war opposition during later conflicts like the Vietnam War. And of course, Freud's psychological frameworks permanently transformed both psychiatry and the social sciences. So the really crucial point here is summed up beautifully by the political philosopher Hannah Arendt. In her 1951 landmark work, The Origins of Totalitarianism, she argued that these movements thrive when isolated, atomized individuals lose their sense of belonging to stable communities and institutions. And historians largely agree that this collapse of faith was a direct cause of totalitarianism's rise. When international attempts at collective security, like the League of Nations, failed to stabilize fragile democracies, that cultural isolation became politically weaponized. Which leaves us with a pretty profound question to wrap things up. If extreme political movements thrive when people lose faith in their institutions and feel culturally isolated, how might a similar loss of community threaten fragile democracies today? The lessons we draw from the disillusionment of the First World War aren't just dry history. They are quite literally the foundation of modern political thought and human rights. Take a moment to really think about what you can take away from this and how the echoes of that lost generation might still be ringing in our modern world.